After we started the anti-war activities in Corning, New York, I didn't have much of a problem from that. People at the college were not very, some people stopped speaking to me, some faculty members stopped speaking to me because they supported the war and they thought it was treasonous to question the war to the degree that we did and to oppose it. Derry Bennett, however, one of the three people involved in our anti-war movement, and it was a pretty small movement, got hostile telephone calls. One day his wife, Barbara Bennett, came up to the college and she was white as a sheet. She was really shaken, and he said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Somebody just called and said that they're going to kidnap our children, they're going to beat you up or worse," and they threatened, made other threats as well. And so he had a very intelligent suggestion. He said, "Well, next time somebody calls, just say, 'Could you identify yourself, sir?' And then say," and most people didn't have the guts to identify themselves. They wanted to make anonymous threats. And so then he said, they told him at the end of the conversation just to say, "Thank you for calling to express your views." And he knew that if that would disarm people who would be afraid to give their names, cowards, and then he also thought it would disarm them when he said thank you for, when she said thank you for expressing your views. And when people would attack us when we spoke at a panel, an anti-war panel, he would say, "Well, thank you for expressing your views," and people who were hostile didn't know how to deal with that. So the biggest storm, though, I had in Corning arose very innocently. Lawrence Rockefeller Jr. came through campaigning. This was the spring of 1967.
For governor?
Yeah, his uncle Nelson Rockefeller was campaigning to be reelected governor of New York. And Larry Rockefeller Jr. was a nice young guy. He was not a brilliant person by any means, and he had a kind of slick PR man with him whose last name was Deerdorf. And so, since I was the sponsor of the Young Democrats Club at Corning Community College, they asked me if our organization would sponsor that meeting where he could talk, he could campaign for his uncle and say why Nelson Rockefeller should be reelected. And so we did sponsor it, because it wasn't, the Republicans had been in power in that county for decades, but they didn't have a young Republican club on campus. So at the speech, he was saying all these great things that Rockefeller was doing, programs to help the poor, and Rockefeller was one of those liberal Republicans who was pretty responsible in terms of social programs. And so at one point I just said, the only thing I said the whole meeting, I said, "Well, some of those programs sound a lot like President Johnson's Great Society legislation. If there's a significant difference, can you tell us what it is?" And so he was kind of puzzled by the question and asked Deerdorf, the PR guy, to explain it. And Deerdorf came up to the mic and he said, "Well, his programs appear to be very similar to Great Society legislation, but the most significant difference is that he would like to see those funds for social programs administered at the local level rather than at the state or national level." And I said, "Well, isn't that kind of odd reasoning? Because it seems to me that there's always much more corruption at the local level than at state or national level, because there are fewer checks and balances." And I said, and I'd certainly hate to see the local Republican machine administering war on poverty funds in this county. That was a pretty innocent or innocuous statement, but that evening, that was early in the day, and either the evening paper or the next morning's paper had a headline, college professor charges corruption in local government. And so they called, the person who wrote the story was the husband of the president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, in Corning, New York. And she had attacked us in print earlier. And this guy called me up and he said, did you charge corruption in the local Republican machine? And I said, no, I did not. I didn't. I just said, I repeated what I'd said. And he said, well, why do you think there's more corruption at the local level than at state and national level? And I said, well, two things. One, there are fewer checks and balances, and I think it's when any one party is in power for decades, I think that breeds corruption too. And I also said in political science classes, I learned that there is generally more corruption at the local level because of the lack of effective checks and balances. And so he said in his quote, he said he'd interviewed one of those, he identified me, and said that I said I believe that because I'd read it in a book one time, making fun of this book knowledge of politics. And so that led to even people in the Democratic Party attacking me, saying that I had no right to charge the local Republican machine with corruption. And I also said at one point, well, that was not my intent, but if the shoe fits, wear it. If people are defensive, then maybe they have something to hide. And so the mayor of Corning wrote a letter to the president of the college, the Corning Community College, who'd been in office only about 6 weeks at that time. His name is Bob Frederick. And so Frederick called me into his office and he showed me a letter that the mayor's name was Nasser, I believe, had written him, and he said he was threatening to sue me for libel if I didn't make a public apology. And so Frederick said, well, what would you do in my place? And I said, well, you've asked me if I'll make an apology, and the answer is no, I have no need to apologize. So you ask what I would do in your case. I would circle the two misspelled words in his letter, and then right at the bottom of it, be serious and send it back. And he said, well, obviously I can't do that. And so he sent him a very political response saying, I'm sorry that this unpleasant, difficult issue has come up, and the first major issue we've dealt with together. So I hope we'll be able to resolve this fairly and amicably. And the guy never did anything past that. It was ridiculous to try to sue me over that. So after 2 years in Corning, around some very good people there, I decided it was time to move on because I wanted to get a teaching job in Japan and to visit the People's Republic of China. So I left and I went back to Lubbock for a short time, then went to San Francisco for several months. And by the way, I was here in San Francisco, that was '67, the summer of love. And I was kind of on the fringe of the hippie movement. I lived in a communal house for a while, and then I didn't want to, excuse me, to take a teaching job because I was definitely wanted to teach in Japan. So I contacted the Institute of International Education here in San Francisco and got some addresses and wrote schools and universities in Japan. And I filled out an application and made an audio tape and got a job at the International Education Center in Tokyo through that correspondence. And I decided to, there was no a set time to begin teaching, but so in the meantime, I took a job working at El Monte Cannery. They were canning peaches at that time in Davis, California, for about 6 weeks, I think it was, during the canning season. And I remember at the boarding house where I was staying, this great old woman was saying to me, she said, "Oh, you've been in San Francisco for a while. Have you seen the hippies?" And I said, "Yeah, I got to know several of them." And she said, "Well, I think it's wonderful that they like to give flowers to people, especially people holding guns. The only suggestion I have, though, I think, is that I think they should grow the flowers they give to people." And so I did that for a while, and it was a little bit dangerous working in the cannery. The floors are wet all the time, and I've always had pretty good balance. And
What was your job there at the cannery?
it was basically just a lot of the peaches fall off the conveyor belts, and they're clean and they wash them well, but the ones that fall off they're a little darker. The ones that go through the system without any problems are more pristine, and the color is slightly different. That was kind of interesting, living in the rooming house and working at that
So
cannery.
what was your job, to pick up the
Yeah, we would with shovels.
the ones that were bruised?
Yeah, the ones that were on the floor. Well, they didn't get necessarily bruised on the floor, but the color changed. In fact, then they would sell those to another cannery. Del Monte didn't can those, or they maybe they canned them, but they didn't put them out under their own brand of Del Monte.
Just peaches, that was all they...
Yeah, that was that time, and I remember a lot of the people working there were undocumented women, Latino women, and it was not bad working conditions. But
Did you eat a lot of peaches? Or?
No.
Probably not after the first day.
Yeah. When you work around those, you don't food like that, you don't eat them. My dad worked in a ketchup factory in New Mexico, and then around 1918 or so, and he said after that he would never eat ketchup anymore because he saw what went into it. But it was a good time, and I decided to. I had the job, but I wanted to go back to the East Coast and go to France to visit Maria Teresa, who became my wife many years later, in Paris. She was working in Paris for UNESCO and for a private businessman. And so I did.
So by the way, you met her in Bogota.
In Bogota in 1964 when I was in the Peace Corps.
And y'all stayed in touch?
Well, we lost touch, and then ironically in '67 in Corning, I drove to Washington D.C. to the biggest anti-war march of that era.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the biggest ever, and I tried to find her mother and brother and sister were living in the Washington D.C. area, and I tried to find them, but I couldn't locate them. But as soon as I got back to Corning, on my desk in the office was a letter that Maria Teresa had sent to me at my parents' house in Lubbock, 2802 Amherst Street, and Mother forwarded it to us. I thought that was such an odd coincidence that I would try without success to find her family, and then go back and find that letter from her from Paris. So I spent a little bit of time after leaving Corning. I went back to Lubbock, and then I had a '58 Mercedes sedan that I'd paid $800 for a couple years before. Black one, that I'd driven across the country 4 times by that time, and I drove back to Washington D.C. and visited with a friend named Paul Lawson for a while, and he bought the car, I think, for $300 or $400, and then I went to New York and spent about 6 weeks or so with a lady friend. Virginia Price was one of my Peace Corps colleagues she was a teacher of psychology at a college about an hour's drive outside New York. And
when did you get the Porsche, the 356?
I got that in And in the summer of '62.
Oh, that was way before then.
Yeah.
Well, okay, 62.
Yeah. No, because I drove the Porsche to New York when I was teaching there. It really deteriorated because sitting up 18 months while I was in the Peace Corps, the ring stuck and it started using oil, and in Corning there's some rust on it, and I didn't drive it much, and I ended up trading it in on the only new car I ever had was a 66 Volkswagen, and I traded the Porsche in. It was a 58 Cabriolet, and I traded it in and got $400 for it.
I remember the smell of that car when I was sitting. It's one of the sharpest memories I've ever had. Just the smell of that leather from that Porsche. Just the smell of the leather. It smells like a luxury car today. Anyway.
Yeah. So then I spent about 6 weeks in New York at that time, and then flew to Luxembourg, and then took train to Paris, and stayed in Paris 2 or 3 months. And I was delayed because I had decided I wanted to go through the Soviet Union and take the Trans-Siberian Express. That was my original plan. Unfortunately, you had to travel through the Soviet Union, you had to make travel arrangements about 3 weeks in advance. And the problem was that I had decided to get the Japanese visa at the Japanese embassy in Paris. I thought that would be the most convenient way to do it, and I had to wait for a while to get the visa. I was running out of money, and I put an ad in the New York International Herald Tribune that I was available to do editing, and the person who contacted me was a very interesting doctor. He's an osteopath. His name is William P. Douglas, and he had an office on the Champs-Élysées, a very fancy office. He lived very well. He made a lot of money as a doctor, but he spent a lot of money too, having that expensive office, and he lived well. And he had patients. His patients were some of the most famous people in the acting world: Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, Charles Boyer, and any number of great
people that spent time in Paris, lived in Paris.
Yeah. And he was an osteopath, a naturopath, and very interesting guy. He was, I think he didn't talk like somebody who was brilliant in fields outside of medicine, because but he decided that since he lived well and not saved much money, he was probably in his mid-60s at that time, he decided that he'd like to write a book about all these famous patients. And so he paid me to do editing, and he is a very, very good storyteller. He knew a lot of interesting events, and I knew about them, and knew all these interesting people, and he had some very reasonable and scientific views about how to care for the human body. And he believed in massage. I believe he was a vegetarian also, and he had all these. By the way, the SS took over his office during the war, and after the war, he was able to go back to the same office, and that's where I met him. And on one occasion, he said, "I know an Irish American writer from Boston that I'd like you to meet. A guy named Matt Carney, I think his name was." And he had a Vietnamese girlfriend. And so Matrice and I had dinner with him, and in fact he took us to this very fancy restaurant near the Champs-Élysées. And I remember the guy and I really clashed. I thought he was dumb, and he supported the war, and he was very outspoken. And the girlfriend was was very, she was from a rich Catholic family in Vietnam, and she supported the war. And actually MT didn't, Maria Teresa didn't say very much during the meeting, during the dinner, but I saw him the next day and he said, well, you know, you better stay away from that girl. She's a communist, sounds like a communist. And I thought that was kind of strange. The most interesting story he ever told me, he mentioned the two that I remember prominently, or one about if you have two oxen working together and one of them dies, if you don't get a new ox for the pair, that the surviving one will often die within a few months. And he said he believed that people literally can die from a broken heart. And
well, it happens all the time.
I thought that was interesting, and you see that with a lot of old couples.
Yeah.
However, I'd never thought of it with animals, but I can see that too. But then he also said that once he would give very deep massages, and he said one time that this nun had some serious back problems, and he gave her a really intense massage, and he said she had an orgasm during that. And again, he was very honest, and I think he didn't embellish his stories. But the most interesting of all was that when the Nazis were coming, they got word that they were invading, they'd be in Paris within a short time. So he decided to leave his office, abandon everything, and carry very few things in a car. And they drove to, he was with people going to Marseille, France, and he said that cars couldn't get gas, so you'd see these really beautiful fancy cars abandoned on the road. And he said they made it to Marseille, and the guy he was traveling with was the brother of the current mayor of Marseille. And he said that the brother wanted to go there to visit his, the guy he was traveling with wanted to go to the mayor's office to visit with his brother. And the French Parliament, the French leadership were meeting there to discuss the conditions of capitulation to the Nazis, to the Germans. And he said he was in the office, the door was open, and he heard all of their discussions, and he spoke French fluently because he'd been there so long. And he said that was really an interesting historical event that he got to witness. So I made a little money from that, and I wanted to continue. I wanted to make reservations with the Aeroflot, the Russian airline service, which was government owned and operated. And you had to make reservations 3 weeks in advance, and I couldn't do that without the visa, the Japanese visa, because if you change it, you have to pay a heavy penalty. So I mistakenly reasoned that if I went to East Berlin under Russian control at that time, that I could probably get the visa faster. Well, that was a well-intentioned but naive assumption, because when I got to East Berlin, I went to the
so you could cross the wall, the border, at that time?
Yeah, it was, that was always exaggerated, because when I was in the Army in '59, I went to East Berlin, and you could just go across.
When did they tear down the wall?
That was under the Reagan administration.
Oh, that was a lot
Much
later. Oh,
yeah. At any rate, I learned once I got to East Berlin that it took 4 weeks there to get the visa. 3 weeks in Paris, but under the Russian control zone, it took 4 weeks to get the visa. So finally, I just decided to abandon the plan of going through the Soviet Union and just go overland, and go through Turkey and Iran to Japan that way. So I bought a train ticket in Berlin, and got on the train in the afternoon, and they said you have to have an exit visa, and you can get an entry visa on the train going into East Germany and East Berlin, but to leave East Germany and East Berlin you have to have an exit visa, and the only way you could get it would be to go to the foreign ministry in Berlin. And so I decided to just take a chance. So I got on the train in the afternoon, and later, there's maybe an hour or so later, about sundown, that this East German immigration officer in an olive drab uniform came in, and he was asking for passports and visas, and I gave him my passport, and he was saying, I pretended I didn't understand any German. I didn't understand all of what he said, but I could figure out that he was saying in German that you have to have an exit visa, and I kept pointing to the entry visa. And then I said, "Ich verstehe nicht. I don't understand." And so finally he got impatient, and he said, "Come with me," and they took me off the train and took me into a little small building on the tracks, near the tracks, and told me to go inside, and he went outside, and they locked the door. I was locked in there for about an hour and a half, but I had the New York Herald Tribune, so I just read it and relaxed. And then he came back later, and they put me, he went with me. They put me on a train going back to Berlin, and so I had to spend the night there. The smallest hotel room I've ever been in. It was about 10 feet by 12 feet or so, and not very high ceilings. And the next day I had to go to the foreign ministry in East Berlin, and as I was traveling there, I think by bus, this older man came up to me, and he spoke native English with an American accent. He said, are you an American? And I said, yes. And he said, well, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And I said, sure. Although after being arrested the day before, I was a little bit skeptical of strangers coming up to me.
You were arrested or detained?
Well, I was arrested and detained for about 2 hours, and then sent back to Berlin. And so he identified himself. He said, my name is Bernard Vogel. I'm a labor writer from Washington State. And he was, at that time, he was a member of the American Communist Party. And until fairly recently, he'd lived in East Berlin. He was supportive of the East Berlin regime. And but then he said it was easier to live in West Berlin. And so he took me all over that day. Very interesting day. I met the kind of cafe intellectual society of East Berlin that included a teacher, several university teachers, and other activists, and I even met a couple of Jordanian men who were dating East German girls. They were trying to figure out a way to marry them and take them back to Jordan.
You didn't think he was a spy or anything,
No,
or it didn't occur to you?
Well,
Okay.
I was a little skeptical at first, but he was...
An informant or something like that?
Well, at first I thought that he might be somebody...
Yeah, trying to set you up.
Yeah. But then he was very intelligent, and he was probably late 60s by that time, and he also spoke fluent German.
From Washington?
He was a German, his background was a German Jew, and raised in this country, and he was a journalist. He wasn't particularly well known, but he was very smart and very fluent in German, and he was anti-war. We had a very good day, very interesting day, and so then I left that night on the same train that I'd taken the day before, but I had a visa that time, and so I went to Munich, and then I took the Orient Express, second or third class, from Munich to
Turkey.
Istanbul, and then I met a hippie couple there that I traveled with some, and
you're on your way to Japan to teach. Okay.
Yeah, and two Japanese guys there. One of them was a tall guy named his first name was
Anyway,
Kikui. Yeah. And at any rate, and he was a big guy, very big for Japanese. He'd played American football at Waseda University, and the other guy with him was a smaller guy who was a boxer. His name was Katsumi. And Katsumi said to him, Kikawa later told me that Katsumi said, that guy must be CIA because somebody with his ideas is not likely to be traveling around. And I said, well, you tell Katsumi that I managed to fool everybody but him. They were on the way back to Japan, and the Turks would make fun of him. They would do like this, but he was big and tough, and Katsumi was a boxer.
Yeah.
So they beat up 5 Turks. That happened just before I met them, but and this is in Istanbul. When we met them, we were near the Blue Mosque, and we met a German couple that had been robbed. They took their passports and their money, and we were trying to help them get their money back. And so we went with the German couple to the house where they'd been robbed, and the Turks came outside for a minute, and they grabbed the German guy and tried to pull him inside, and we grabbed him and pulled him back, and we threatened them some, but then I think they called the cops, and then we left. And after that, I traveled with the couple for a while, and we ended up getting into Ankara, taking the Orient Express to Ankara, and got off there, and it was early in the morning, and we didn't have any Turkish money. We couldn't even buy the tea, the chai, and this older Turkish guy came over and he bought us tea. And I had to communicate with people in German because people didn't speak English, French, or Spanish. And so my German was terrible, and the Turks spoke even worse German than I did, at least grammatically. But we could communicate. In fact, I said, thank you very much for being so kind to us. And he said in German, that's okay, your people treated me well when I was in Germany. And I said, no, I'm not German, I'm American. And he said in German, oh, the same thing. Germans and Americans are the same, he said.
By the way, I have a postcard that you sent home to Grandma from Turkey.
Turkey.
Mm-hmm. One in your postcard. Anyway.
Yeah. Then we were in Iran Turkey 3 weeks, and Iran for 3 weeks, and in Tehran I had to ride home for money again, and I did, and got some money. But then by the time I finally got the ticket cost only $300 from Tehran to Yokohama, Japan, 7,000 miles roughly in the Soviet Union, but I had to sell my raincoat and a pair of Levi's because I had only $7 left after I paid for the ticket. And
Levi's are worth a lot of money in Japan.
But
Europe.
this was in I sold them in Iran.
And that's when the Shah was
Yeah,
in power, right?
Yeah, and I got a free trip all the way from Ankara to Tehran, because the people these Iranians would go to Munich and buy TV sets and Mercedes and take them back to Iran and sell them. And they would find these European hippies or American hippies who wanted to go to Afghanistan and Nepal. And that was a good bit of the distance to their destination. So they would allow these Iranian guys to put TV sets and Mercedes on their passports. They would declare themselves as owners, and then they would once they got to Tehran, they would sell them, and then they would, in fact, the Iranians, when that happened, they would confiscate the passport when they came into the country and return the passports only when the taxes on those export items were paid, import items. And so I let them put TV set or something on mine. So we were trapped in Tehran for about 3 weeks because they were having trouble selling all this stuff and getting their passports back. And this guy that I was traveling with, kind of a very plain hippie girl who came from a very prosperous family. Her name was Martha Vidigan. She was from Santa Barbara, I believe. And the guy's name was Bill Buckner, the same as a friend of mine in Lubbock.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really a brilliant poet, very interesting guy, but kind of seriously unbalanced. Or, you know, he said he'd done about 500 acid trips, and that might have been part of it. But he would, on the train, he would. At one point, we were traveling, and this one guy was sitting across from us in a compartment, 3 people on each side, 1 bench, and 3 people on this side. And this guy was, he was staring at us some because he was kind of curious, this Turkish guy. And so all of a sudden Bill said, if that guy doesn't quit staring at me, I'm going to hit him in the face. And I said, you can't do that. And so, and the guy knew we were talking about him, but he didn't understand, so he was curious and smiling even more. And so I went and met a Turkish sergeant who spoke English. There were some Turkish troops on the train. So I got the Turkish sergeant to come in and kind of calm down the situation. That was one of the incidents on the train that well, this guy Bill provoked it. Later in Tehran, he was out one day and he got opium to smoke. And he came back and his eyes were about that big around, and I got very nervous because at that time using serious drugs brought a death sentence. Okay, well, I learned in Tehran that I could get a visa for the Soviet Union in 7 days, and so I bought the ticket, and I had only $7 left after paying for the ticket. So that's when I sold my raincoat and a pair of Levi's to get a little extra money. And so I took the train from Tehran to Azerbaijan, then Soviet Armenia, Yerevan. And I learned there that the arrangements I'd made with the travel agent in Tehran, the in-tourist people in Yerevan weren't honoring them. They told me that the ticket included not only transportation from Tehran all the way to Yokohama, but I would have hotel accommodations and meals and tours, and all of that would be included. But then when I got to Yerevan, Armenia, they said that the meals, you know, and I had only $7 left, and they said the meals I'd get only breakfast, not lunch and dinner, and I was upset about that, and so I rang the people, and this very unpleasant woman was saying, well, that's the way it is, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, you cable Moscow and tell them that either you change your policy or the person representing you at the travel agency in Tehran misrepresented the situation. And so I went up higher into the system and dealt with the guy. She said, no, there's nothing we can do. And I dealt with the guy who reminded me of an Armenian, Richard Nixon. He looked a little bit, he reminded me of Nixon in a way. He spoke English fluently, but he was a real kind of stubborn bureaucrat, I thought. And so I went through the whole thing with him, and he said, well, there's nothing we can do. And so at one point I was so upset that I said, well, I'm sympathetic toward socialism, but when the capitalists make a contract, they generally keep it, so you people are not keeping your word. And I don't appreciate that, and I intend to challenge that decision any way I can. And so he said, well, there's nothing we can do. It's just we would like to be, we understand your point, and we agree that you're right in a way about the misinformation. And so I said, well, I want you to consider it. And so at one point I said, well, if you're not going to honor your contract, I'll travel to the Soviet Union, but I don't intend to use your hotels, I don't intend to go on the tours, and I don't intend to take the meals. I'll just stay at the airport and not do any of these things. And so I gave him back all the vouchers for hotels and meals and tours. And he said, no, you can't, you can't, if you, as a foreigner, you can't stay in the Soviet Union without hotel reservations. And I said, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to deport me? And he said, well, we can. And I said, well, go ahead and do it. And I just put everything down on his desk and walked out and wrote a long letter to Derry Bennett in Corning explaining the situation. And then I took a nap. And I went back to the office and I said, what have you decided? He said, well, I want you to speak to the director of Intourist. And so this very well-dressed man came in. He was older, kind of heavy-set man, probably in his mid-60s, in a very nicely tailored suit. And he didn't speak English, so the guy who reminded me of Richard Nixon had to interpret. And so he said, well, first of all, they've told me about your situation, and I agree with you that our agent either misinformed you or there's a change in policy that he wasn't aware of. And so he said, there's no way, there's only one way we can correct the situation. And he said, this is what I propose. And he said, first of all, tonight you'll be my guest at dinner, and then I'll wire ahead I was going to Tashkent after that, and then to Khabarovsk, and then across the Japan Sea to Yokohama, to Japan. And so I said, well, I don't want any special treatment. I just want what I paid for and what your representative in Tehran said I would get for my travel arrangements. And so he said, well, I thought you might say that, so here's what I'd like you to consider. I'm not making this offer to you as head of Intourist to a foreign tourist, and I'm not making this as a Soviet citizen to an American citizen, but I'm making this suggestion as one human being to another. And I said, well, I appreciate that, and let me think about it. So I said, I'll be back in a half hour and let you know my decision. And so I walked around for a while and then went back and said, okay, I'm able to get some change when I give my vouchers for breakfast. I can get some change, and then I can go. I'd gone to one of their commissaries and bought lunch meat and rich dark Russian bread and things. So I said, I can manage. So here's my response. I'll accept your offer to have dinner with you this evening, but you don't need to wire ahead to the other cities and have the leader of Intourist there accommodate me or pay for my evening meal, because I'll be able to manage on my own. And so he shook my hand, and that's what we did. And then I had another, because they threatened to deport me for not having, if I gave up my hotel reservations, but I didn't think they would. So
why was it so important for them to accommodate you? Was just they didn't want the bad publicity with Americans?
Well, I think that is partly it. And the woman and the guy who reminded me of Nixon, I don't think they cared that much. But the older man was very intelligent and humane, and he came up with a solution that I thought worked. He was a very intelligent negotiator, so he negotiated a solution that I could live with and they could live with too. But I had another problem when I left the country. I'd had only, as I said, $7 when I bought the ticket. So I exchanged, and that was the equivalent in $7 US in Iranian currency. And so at the end, I still had about $6 or $7, and I went to in Soviet currency, and I said, I want to exchange this for American dollars. And they said, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And they said, because you exchanged Iranian money for Soviet money. And I said, well, I was in Iran. Or do you think I'd be spending American dollars in Iran? And so they said, no, you have to spend the money here because you can't take it with you, and we won't exchange it. And so I said, well, that's absurd. And so I said to the person at the table there making these arrangements, I said, if I'm going to stand here until you change my money or you arrest me. So you take your choice. And so he said, what? And so he went over and talked to some higher ranking bureaucrat. And that guy came over, and I explained to him what I was going to do. And there were a lot of people behind me. I said, I'm going to hold up the line. What you're doing is absurd and it's unfair. And if you want to arrest me, you just go right ahead, because I'm not leaving. I'm not moving until you refund my money. And so they gave me then American dollars. And so I arrived in Japan.
Yokohama?
Yeah, in Yokohama, without knowing whether I still had a job, because I was late getting there because of all those delays.
Well, you said it didn't matter what time you started.
Well, but I didn't know that at the beginning, because it was a private language school and they didn't have ongoing semesters.
Yeah, like semesters.
Yeah. And so I arrived in, and when I contacted the school, they advanced me money and helped me find a place to live, and advanced me money, and it worked out very well. And so I taught there I was involved in political activities, anti-war activities from the very beginning, and we even joined one demonstration once with demanding that the U.S. return Okinawa to Japan. And so...
Did the Japanese hate Americans at that time?
Oh, no, no.
After what happened?
No.
It's incredible.
No.
Just
well,
incredible. I guess they were at odds with the military rulers.
The Japanese people overwhelmingly opposed the Vietnam War. However, the reactionary government, the Liberal Democratic Party, was the name of the leading party in Japan. They supported the war. They were American proxy in every way, and they didn't like the large anti-war demonstration. Japanese left was very strong, very powerful, and one of the most powerful organizations in the country was a peace group called Beherin. In fact, at one point we started a group called Gaikokujin Beherin, Foreign Beherin. And we...
not under American occupation?
No.
Oh,
This was many years after occupation. And the Japanese had really come back and were very prosperous at that time.
Yeah, very.
And they... And the Japanese left they had these internecine struggles between left parties. In fact, there was one group that was supportive of Soviet communism, and another group that I had more to do with. The Japanese Socialist Party were pro-China, People's Republic of China, not pro-Soviet. And those groups fought each other literally in the streets sometimes, but anti-war demonstrations, there would be many thousands of people, and on occasion they would have some of us speak at those rallies. And
it's kind of like America. They were polarized as far as war and against war. Generally.
But many more Japanese actively opposed the war than in this country. But the government was still dominated by American foreign policy.
You don't generally think of the Japanese people as divided. I mean,
there's something about Asian cultures that make them more united or more...
they're more homogenous. They claim to be.
Yeah,
but
well, they are. And China has 55 minorities, but the overwhelming majority is the Han majority. But in Japan, these people were very, the Japanese left was militantly opposed to the war. And a lot of major organizations were involved in the anti-war movement.
Again, what year is this?
68, 69,
Okay.
I was in Japan. And it was 69 when I met Earl Reynolds.
Yeah,
the,
let's go on with that.
A very interesting man. He was 59 years old at that time.
Anthropologist.
He's an PhD in anthropology from a small college in Iowa.
Huh.
And he was from, he'd gone to Japan as an anthropologist to do research on the atomic bomb victims in Hiroshima. And I guess maybe Nagasaki too, but he was based in Hiroshima. And he told me once that his life before he was sent to Japan to do that research revolved around his profession of anthropology and his tennis game and his family. And he's kind of a very moral person and very outspoken.
What kind of anthropology, by the way?
I'm not sure, but he was maybe cultural anthropology. I'm not sure.
Paleontology at all?
I don't know. He never discussed that much, but his reports on the atomic bomb victims were jarring and shocking, and the State Department asked him to tone them down. They said, "This is you're reigniting the controversy of the
Published in the
atomic bomb."
newspaper or magazine?
Well, no. First was just his report to the State Department and the U.S. government, and then later, when they told him to tone things down, that's what politicized it. And he was very outspoken, and was he even he started writing articles about what he did, and then later he's the one. He owned the yacht, Quaker yacht Phoenix. He wasn't a Quaker, but he worked with Quakers on so many occasions. He was always identified. The Quaker yacht Phoenix would interrupt nuclear testing.
I didn't know Quakers had yachts.
Well, not too many of them do. But this was not a luxury yacht. It was, I don't know, it wasn't worth a whole lot of money.
I was on that ship.
Yeah. Well, he interrupted nuclear testing by the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. And in fact, he would sail into like Bimini. You're familiar with the name Bimini? That's where some of the nuclear testing was going on. And they would take his ship, and they towed it once 2,000 miles to Hawaii, and even damaged the ship some. And that's also the ship that sailed in '68, the year before we were on it, sailed to Haiphong Harbor to deliver medical supplies to North Vietnam during a bombing raid by the U.S. And
boy, he was quite an activist.
Yeah, he was. He wasn't on that ship. That was the skipper of that ship was a young Quaker activist who went to prison over his anti-war activities, named Bob Eaton. I heard a lot of good things about him. I never met him. I don't know whatever happened to him, but so we met Reynolds, and I indicated that I wanted to go, and one other friend of mine there, Brian Victoria. In fact, there's a video out now on him. He's still doing anti-war activities. Brian was an interesting case. He's from Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was sent to Japan in the mid-'60s to teach ESL and to do missionary work, communist missionary work in ESL by the Methodist Church. And he converted to Zen Buddhism, and he became a great admirer of Mao. So he went from a teacher, missionary, ESL, and English as a second language, to a Maoist and a Buddhist. He was a Soto Zen Buddhist, and he walked around in his robes, and one day a week he would...
Did he shave his head?
Yeah. And one day a week he would go to a particular section of Tokyo where other Buddhist priests would be there with their bowl asking for alms. That's how he supported himself.
That reminds me of the Hare Krishna. I don't see him around, but Used to see him all the time.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, but
yeah.
Brian was
Of course, it's
interesting. He was intelligent, and he was audacious, and he was very theatrical, and we were all the riot police knew him, and they would call him Victoria Coon. And here's one of the things that I saw him do once. The riot police never beat up any of us. The worst ever than me, they pushed me with a shield, and I saw them hit a young bystander so hard. I've never seen anybody hit so hard with the club. They had clubs about this long.
Yeah.
They pushed me out of the way, and this guy was standing up against the building. I'm not sure he was even in the demonstration. And the riot policeman hit him in the head and just knocked him to the concrete, and blood was coming out of his nose and his head from the blow. I don't know. I don't think it killed him, but it seriously hurt him. And all the riot police knew Brian, and if they nudged him some, he would fall down, and the photographers would get a picture of him on the concrete with these riot police standing around with their shields and their clubs drawn.
So you decided to go ahead and try to go into People's Republic of China.
Yeah,
on your own.
6 of us were on the ship. We sailed and we met in Nagasaki harbor, and that sailed from there. And the Japanese immigration tried to delay us any way we could. The U.S. government opposed the trip, and
Well, now how did they know? Was it publicized, or I guess maybe they knew about it through intelligence?
No, we were under surveillance. Police,
Okay, yeah. Well,
police
sure.
followed us around,
Uh-huh.
and then one night they arrested one of us, a guy named James Wada, who was not political at all, but he was a friend of mine. I got him to go to the demonstration, and he's the only one who didn't have his alien registration card. So they arrested him, and I went to his apartment and got it and went back, but they still kept us there interrogating us all night, basically. And
Why are they so concerned about you making contact with the Chinese?
well, because the U.S. was at that point,
Tense
the U.S.
political
still
situation.
said at that point the U.S. still said the Chinese government was in Taiwan rather than the mainland, the People's Republic.
Yeah.
And the Japanese people weren't as strongly supportive of China as they were in opposition to the Vietnam War, but they did, in fact, and there's still a lot of discrimination at that time by the Japanese against Koreans and Chinese. But as China became more powerful, that changed, and now there's not nearly as much discrimination against Koreans as there was at that time. But so we sailed across the Japan Sea. Okay, well, the 6 of us sailed on the Quaker Yacht Phoenix across the Japan Sea. We left from Nagasaki Harbor in June, and took us about 4 or 5 days to sail across the Japan Sea. We were going to sail up the river to Shanghai, and a Chinese gunboat met us when we first got into Chinese water. We had the support of ethnic Chinese in Tokyo who had close ties to the People's Republic of China, but we were kind of naive and not recognizing that the Cultural Revolution was still going on in China. And the Chinese first said, go back, go back. And they were sending these messages with their semaphore signals, and nobody on our ship could understood what the message was. So finally, when we were close enough that the Chinese gunboat could yell at us, they said, wait you, go back, go back. And so we said we wanted to engage them, and one of the people in the group, a guy named Jonathan Mirsky, spoke Mandarin fluently, so we were able to communicate with them, and he explained that we were part of the American peace movement, and we were against the war, the Vietnam War, and we also wanted to begin to establish diplomatic and commercial ties with China to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. And they said, well, we appreciate your intentions, but if you're interested in the peace movement, go back and work in your own country. But they said, we'll give you fuel. We had an auxiliary diesel engine in the sailboat, the yacht, and they said, we'll give you diesel for your fuel, and we'll also give you food and provisions. And we said, no, we'll take water, but that we don't need anything else. And so we waited around for 5 days, hoping they would change their mind, and they didn't. And at one point, Mirsky, who was maybe close to 40 at that time, I think he was, and he was a teacher at Dartmouth University, and he wrote to New York.
So you were anchored there right out offshore?
Yeah,
for 5 days?
Yeah, we were in Chinese water. We weren't near the shore.
Yeah.
And so we negotiated with them, and they kept saying no, and they said, we appreciate what you're doing, but they said no American will enter China so long as your troops are occupying our province of Taiwan. I was disappointed that they never expressed opposition to the Vietnam War anytime we were communicating with them, but they emphasized the U.S. domination of bases all over the world, and especially bases in Taiwan. And so at one point, Mirsky jumped in the water and started swimming toward their boat, and I thought about doing that too, but they just pulled away from him, so he couldn't swim to the boat. And so he came back, and after that we decided there was no way they were going to change their mind, so we went back to Nagasaki harbor, and then the Japanese wouldn't let us back in the country. And we argued that we hadn't entered another country, it was just like being out at sea.
Yeah. And
so after a lot of we had to live on the yacht for a month in Nagasaki harbor, and we finally negotiated a compromise. Those of us, 3 of us were living in Japan. The 3 other were from the U.S. and planned to return, so they weren't concerned about a visa. They gave the 3 of us 2-month visas. And that's when I went to Okinawa, thinking that I could get back in the country and then give me my 1-year, my 4-year multiple entry teaching visa with a period of stay of 1 year in each instance. And so they didn't do that, and that's when I negotiated with them. At one point, they offered me a 6-month visa, and I said, well, I can't, matter of principle, I can't take that because you're discriminating. I didn't break any Japanese law. You're denying me my freedom of speech. I have every right to criticize the Vietnam War and make policy statements in Japan and the U.S. so long as I don't break any law. And so they said, well, if you don't get back on the ship, and if the ship leaves without you, you'll be arrested. And I said, well, is there any way I can continue negotiating after the ship leaves? And one of the older people in authority said yes, but then when the ship left, they arrested me. And I said, well, they said I could continue to negotiate, and whoever, the guy who said that never was around anymore. So
do they have freedom of speech?
Oh, sure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's a democracy.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, Japan had 4 English dailies. Tokyo had 4 English dailies, and 11 million people at that time, I believe. A very modern city, of course.
Maybe a lot of kids from the American occupation, possibly.
Well, some.
Japanese American.
But not too many. At any rate, when that happened, I was angry and shocked, and I said, well, you've arrested me illegally. I'm not going to eat until you release me. And so I immediately started a hunger strike and went 9 days. And I called the U.S. Embassy, and I talked to a guy, I think his name was Norm Swanson. I said, I'm being held illegally. I was arrested illegally, and I'm being held illegally. What's the embassy going to do about it? And he started laughing. And I said, well, listen, this is not a very funny, I don't see any humor in this, and I don't appreciate your lack of support and your derisive laughter. So, and I'm not going to be locked up forever, but I'll tell you that.
What kind of a cell were you in? By yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As a political prisoner, I would say.
Well, not really,
detained.
because I was just in a cell by myself, and they said, well, you're being detained because you're in the country illegally. And I said, well, I'm not gonna eat until you release me. And so there's a place, my cell had bars and had glass, very thin glass. And there was an open area about maybe 18 inches by about 15 inches or so, where they put the food tray. And I said, I'm not going to eat, so I'd leave it there and I'd push it off, and then I had to catch it to keep it from falling. And so I went, after 5 days, I had only water, and they could tell I was getting weaker, and they were afraid that I might die or I might be physically, seriously harmed from lack of food. And so they sent a doctor in to examine me, and I cooperated, but they said, we're going to force feed you. And I said, no, you're not. I'll fight you, and I'm going to see my lawyer. And a guy, a very smart lawyer, decided he wasn't part of the Japanese anti-war movement, but he read about my case. Miyake was his name, and he spoke English fluently, very smart guy. And he came to defend me free. And I said,
why didn't the American embassy send somebody within a day or
because
so?
they wanted to see me locked up and deported.
Because of your political views. That's why he left,
Yeah.
and he wasn't going to support you.
Yeah, and see, I would, after several days, the worst part was probably the third to the fifth day. I went 9 days and lost 35 pounds. I had just water each day, and I would exercise a little bit in the cell, and I had some claustrophobia in the cell too, so I would walk in a figure eight and exercise some, not use too much energy because I was weak. And I could tell as I got weaker that my heart would flutter a little bit, and when I would walk, I would, you know how old men kind of walk stiffly, I would walk that way. But otherwise, I was 33 at the time and pretty healthy. So
Had you met Yuko by that time?
yeah,
or?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. She would visit me, and
But not your wife?
no, she
Okay.
wasn't. Yeah, and so they agreed to release me. So I started eating again, and I got out, and I was out for a while, and then I got arrested again, and then.
How's that?
Well, because you're just released, you're in what they call an exclusion. We have the same system here. A serious issue is pending, so you're put in an exclusion category. You don't have a visa, but you're allowed to be in the country, but they can, since you're in that exclusion category, they can lock you up again whenever they want to. So a couple times they would lock me up and then let me out, and then they'll lock me up again. And so, and at one point, Yuko and I got married by, she'd been a student of mine, and we became close. And then after we got released and got married, and our paper was in all the 4 major Tokyo newspapers. And then the very next day, 11 hours after the wedding, I was back in a cell in the immigration center, and then they went through the end of the process. They would ask me all these long questions.
Why didn't they just deport you right off the bat?
Well, because they have to go through a procedure to investigate the circumstances, and they would ask me all these questions, and I would answer them, and they would write it all out. These dumb old guys would write it all out very tediously, and then they would ask me if I wanted to sign all their notes, their record in Japanese. And I said, no, I won't sign it. And they said, well, would you sign it if we put it in English? And I said, no, I told you the truth. But like on one instance, they said, oh, his name was Oda Makoto, and they said Oda Minoru. And because you could read the character 2 different ways.
You don't know that.
And I said, no, I don't know any Oda Minoru. But I did know Oda Makoto. He was a leader of that behavior in the peace group. In fact, he's the one who gave my name to Noam Chomsky and told him about my situation. And later, when I communicated with Chomsky about a year after that, he said, I know of your case and I would like working with you. I was thinking of applying to MIT graduate program. He said, I don't think you'd be happy here.
Psycholinguistics.
Yeah, yeah. And so at that point, after the investigation was over, the process involves an investigation and then it's a real kangaroo court, and then they conclude whether you were truly in the country illegal and then they order the deportation. And once you're ordered deported, they ship you to Yokohama and you await deportation there with other people who are incarcerated, and including Chinese. I met David Dahl at the Immigration Detention Center in Tokyo. They sent him in to convince me to give up and go ahead and go home and sue the Japanese immigration from this country, because they told me that if you sue us, you could be locked up until your case is heard 18 months or 2 years from now. So David pointed that out. And
didn't he work with the Japanese intelligence at one time, or
he was working with the Japanese occupation in China and was almost executed by the nationalist Chinese at the end of the war. But then he was on. His trial was highly publicized because he said that the nationalist Chinese had put him on trial. That he said, you charged me as being a traitor, but you were the traitors. You didn't fight the Japanese the way the Mao people did, and so you're the traitors, not me. And so then the reporters were going to him, trying to interview him, and after that, the Chinese government went to him and they said, since you speak Japanese fluently, we need somebody in charge of repatriating the Japanese prisoners of war. And so they said, well, you can't talk to the press about any of this, but if you'll agree to work with us, we'll make you a colonel in the army and put you in charge. And they did. And David was a very talented businessman.
What kind of work did he do back? He wasn't a teacher or anything.
No,
like
no,
that. Just
but he was a
businessman.
Yeah, he was he came from a rich northern Chinese family that was partly Mongolian, and he was a millionaire on 2 or 3 occasions. And
he told me at one time growing up that he wasn't allowed to leave a single grain of rice on his plate.
Yeah. David had a very interesting life and very, very intelligent person. One of the smartest, wisest people in many ways. He had some failings, but he was a very interesting guy. So, and I got to know him much better. He was in Yokohama with the Chinese on the 2nd floor. They segregated the ethnic Chinese in Japan. If you were Chinese from Malaysia or someplace on a seaman, you were put with the Western prisoners like us. And so we were there. I was there 40 altogether. I was locked up 57 days in Japan when I was finally deported. And on one occasion we had a demonstration to show our solidarity with the Chinese prisoners who were on the 2nd floor, and they weren't given as good a diet as the rest of us were. And so we protested that, and that's the only time they ever brought out their clubs. They didn't club any of us. It was my idea, but since Victoria spoke Japanese fluently, he gave the speech, and they locked him up in solitary for a couple of weeks. And so when Yuko, my wife at that time, came to see me, and the guard was sitting there, I wanted her to know about Victoria being put in solitary, but they didn't want me to say something like that, because the plan was to convey that to her and have her leak it to the media, because there were a lot of coverage of us after.
At what time did they take all those?
Just a second. And so the guard was sitting there who spoke English. We couldn't touch each other sitting across. And I said to him, is it okay if I tell her that Victoria's locked up in solitary because of the demonstration? He said, no, you can't say that. And he didn't catch on, that allowed me to conclude that police bureaucrats are an international class. They're not as smart as the general population generally. And so he had, she had the information then, and she did release it to the media.
Yeah.
What was the question?
The question is, I remember seeing the press reports that Grandma had cut out and put in a scrapbook. At what time, when did you get into the press in America?
Well, during the hunger strike, because
even the local PJ, I think.
Yeah, my friend Larry Lau contacted 4 people in Congress and the Senate, in the House and the Senate, including Fulbright. And he said that he had people thinking I was going to die of the hunger strike, and so that made big press. And AP, one reporter used to call my dad fairly often. He kept saying, "Is your son a pacifist or not?" And my dad said, "Well, we never discussed that, but he's a veteran." And so then, when I was deported, made the New York Times in 1969. And after that, I did sue and had a case. I went back a year, and about 15 months later, and we lost. They said that it was legal to incarcerate and deport.
Yeah, would have been.
But one other part of that is kind of relevant, I think. And every day at Yokohama, I would call the U.S. Embassy and ask to talk to the ambassador. So one day, Ambassador Armin H. Meyer, who'd been an ambassador to Iran before, came on the line, and he said, "Well, Mr. Scott, I understand you hate America and Japan." And I said, "Well, first of all, that's not only a childish and absurd thing for somebody in your position to say, it also indicates what biased information you've gathered on my case." And he said, "Well, you mean you don't?" I said, "I'm an American citizen, I love my country, and I've had a very good life in Japan. And many people in Japan support me, more people support than criticize me." And I said, and you people have done nothing. So I want you to know that I'm not going to be in here forever. And when I get back to the U.S., I'll not only let the American public know through the media, but I'll let my elected representatives know how ineffective, how oppositional and uncooperative you people were when I needed you. He said, "Well, you criticize us for intervening in Vietnam, but then you want us to intervene on your case." And I said, "Well, if you don't understand that difference, it'd be a waste of my words to try to explain it to you." I said, "But all I'm asking you to do is just make a formal inquiry as to why I'm not released, because I meet all the requisites for release in Japan while I'm pending the trial, my suit against the Japanese government. And why don't you make that request?" And he said, "Well, because we don't believe you. We believe that they're justified in holding you." And I said, "Well, but you're denying my due process, because I will sue Japan from the U.S., but I'd prefer to be here to stay until my suit comes up." And so I said, and I assure you, I'll point out to the American people on every occasion I have that you did nothing on my behalf. And he said, "Well, Mr. Scott, threatening us is not going to help you." And I said, "Well, I'm 40 miles away, and how I could be threatening you physically is that's also absurd."
Was it that during the McCarthy era and all that, or not?
No,
okay.
no, that was McCarthy era. But was 50 around the height of the Cold War was around 53.
But behind the scenes, they thought you were, pro China, pro People's Republic of China.
Oh yeah, sure.
That was the whole that's why they gave you such a hard time, basically.
Well, the embassy, they didn't like the anti-war activities or the trip to China. Those were the two main reasons.
Yeah.
So at any rate, then after I was deported, I ended up going to Lubbock for a while, and then coming back out here and teaching in the adult program of San Francisco Unified School District, and ironically, my first job was teaching at the Army Education Center in Presidio.
Yeah, Presidio.
And about a year before that, we'd protested a guard at that stockade at Presidio.
Yeah, I remember.
Had killed a kind of semi-retarded soldier who was locked up, and he said, "What would you do if I ran?" And the guard said, "I'd shoot you." And he ran, and the guard killed him with a shotgun, and we protested that in Tokyo. And then ironically, that was my first assignment here. But all the troops that I taught except one were against the war rather than for the war.
Well, Rodger, that concludes our first section of the interview. Later, in a few weeks, we'll continue on. When you arrive back in San Francisco, you buy your Victorian mansion, you and MT resume your life here, you're union president. So everybody look forward to that next time. And if you missed the family reunion in Aspermont in 2019 in October, here you are.